Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Remarkable Insights. My name is Pete Horsley. I'm the founder of Remarkable. We are a division of Cerebral Palsy Alliance. We have the backing of iCare Foundation, Telstra, and also Microsoft. We exist essentially to harness technology and innovation to see social, economic, and physical inclusion of people with disability. Our principal way of doing that is through an accelerator program that we run. It's a 16-week accelerator program. It happens once per year, and we give support through some funding, mentoring, and other supports as well. Really trying to see early stage businesses get through to commercialization and to grow the impact of their businesses. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, pay my respects to elders past and present. We are on sacred land, and wherever you are calling in from, want to acknowledge our elders past and present from there. Also want to acknowledge that we stand on the shoulders of those people with disability who have fought for inclusion and advocated for a world that knows the talents and the skills and the gifts that people with disability bring. So we acknowledge those people who have come before us. Today's conversation is part of Remarkable Insights, and it's called that disability inclusion is good for the bottom line. And we know that there's significant opportunity to leverage tech innovation to drive an inclusive future, but who is actually left behind as we push forward, as technology kind of transforms around us? And Remarkable Insights really wants to ask the question, how can we harness Remarkable Insights to create a more inclusive now, rather than waiting for the future? So for anyone who wants to join the conversation, please jump on socials. You can tag us using one of our social handles, so Remarkable Tech. You can do that on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Also Remarkable_Tech on Instagram. And also if you can use the hashtag Remarkable Insights. This event has live captioning, so you can open up closed captions down below. We also, thanks to Mark Sandon, who is our Auslan interpreter today. Welcome, Mark. We'll also be recording this event, so if you can't stay for the full 45 minutes, then you can check back in, or if you want to share this with someone else, check back in on our YouTube channel. It will be up there in a couple of days, so make sure you subscribe to that. So today we are joined by Rich Donovan, CEO of Return on Disability Group in Toronto, Canada. We have Rachel Yang, Investment Manager at Impact Investment Group. And we have Tamara Reinich, Associate Partner at Arima Research, calling from Bendigo. So welcome, panelists. Just a reminder as well, as this is a webinar, if you have any questions, we want to hear from you, the listeners, as we go along. So please make sure you use the Q&A function down below, not just the chat. And make sure you post any questions that you have for any of our panelists as we go along. So let's get into this. There's been I guess a growth in understanding that that there is an immense value in the disability market, and perhaps underappreciated and untapped. We have organisations talking about things like the purple pound or the disability dollar and the value of that. And Rich, your research has shown that this is valued somewhere between $9 trillion and $13 trillion per year. We have 1.3 billion people with a disability around the world. That's almost equivalent to the population of China. So we're talking significant numbers here. And yet this market is relatively untapped, and it's primarily thought of in the realm of kind of charities and not-for-profits. Then we have impact investment or conscious capital. And we've seen a trebling of the impact investment in Australia in the last 2 years alone. And that's a figure I'm sure that's replicated elsewhere in the world. This growth is happening amongst investors, I guess, who want to see both a social and economic return on their investment. So today we're here to really explore those two phenomena, and we want to propose or hypothesize that there's actually a coming convergence of those two things that create immense opportunities and an immense possibility. So Rach, let's start with you. What's happening broadly around the impact investment market in Australia and around the world?
Thanks, Pete, and hi, everyone. So there's really been a growth in impact investment in recent times. As you mentioned, Pete, the growth in the last 2 years has almost kind of tripled, and in Australia alone, that kind of brings us to around $19 billion in impact investments. Globally, the GIN, so Global Impact Investing Network, found in their report recently that now the market globally has reached $1 trillion. And so that significant growth is really exciting for the impact investment world, but also for social and environmental problems that we need to solve, and having the optimism that there are solutions on the way that impact investors can invest in. We're also seeing that the pandemic hasn't really slowed the investments in the impact space, because actually it's highlighting some of the key areas that we need to address. So the GIN, as I mentioned before, has done a report recently, and they've also found that some investors are even looking to invest more in these times, which are tough, and you would expect investment to retract. So it's exciting times for the impact investment world.
So we are seeing this momentum, I guess, is definitely there. So and then Tamara, last month our Insight session talked about it kind of focused specifically on the disability sector in Australia, and as the greatest nation building project that we've seen, with more than $250 billion of government money being invested into this sector over the next 10 years. You've been on the inside of NDIA in the role prior to the one that you're in right now. What did you hope would happen outside of government around investment and market development?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. In reflection, we were building an innovation strategy, and I think what you said earlier, Pete, is that we saw that people really fought for the scheme, and there seems to be that fight around change and something different and challenging what that scheme should look like has really dropped away. So I think that my reflections is that there's been a lot of permission seeking around innovation and new and different models. I think the best solutions don't come from government, and they need that groundswell. They need people with disability and working with providers to really march that charge for change and different.
Brilliant. And Rich, you've got a background in portfolio and investment risk management. You've said that there is a disconnect between opportunity and market activity. What did you mean by that?
Well, you've got a full demand in people with disabilities that is almost 2 billion people globally. They want things that everybody else wants, but they want them in a different flavor, right? The demand is similar to everybody else. They're just somewhat amplified. So very few people recognize that. Right now, they're looking at disability as a charity effort, as a government service, and they're not looking what's underneath there, which is demand, which is the need to be delighted, the need to grow their career, just like everybody else. So where the disconnect comes is CEOs look at disability and they say, didn't we give to that charity last year? Aren't we already doing something in that space? And the reality is, when they do that, they miss demand. And they miss the opportunity to go have a conversation with the customer and understand what they want. That's the big disconnect. And
so do you see? Is it a matter of kind of that we're just not measuring the right things? Is that what you see?
It could be that simple. It could be that we're making this way too complex, right? If we do what we do best as a business, and we focus on what the customers actually want, and we actually have a conversation with people with disabilities, guess what? They'll tell you exactly what they want.
Yeah.
All you gotta do is ask the right questions and shut up and listen.
That's great. And I guess, can you give us some examples of some of the companies that your organisation has studied who are unlocking this value of the disability market? Can you give us some examples?
So we covered 1,500 companies in North America, the biggest businesses that are publicly traded. By far the best businesses in the disability space are technology companies. Large cap multinational technology companies. So the Googles, the Apples, Microsofts, the Amazons. These are the guys that figured out by disability use case. They can study how people with disabilities use things, use environments, consume products, and convert those use cases into innovation for core customers. And when they do that, returns take off. And what these big tech companies have done over the last 5 to 10 years is they piloted this quickly. They got an outsized return, and then they scaled it. By the way, that's the way you do business every day with every other product, with every other market. It's no different than what we do every day. We just generally don't do that in disability.
That's brilliant. Yeah, it makes absolute sense, right? And then, Rach, why do you think investors have been slow in the disability market?
So I think, as Rich was saying, that there's been kind of a preconception and I guess myth almost that it's more for the not-for-profit space and government space, and that there's a trade-off between financial returns and the kind of realm in the disability space. And that's why people have thought it's been sitting in the not-for-profit world or government space, where really that's not the case. As Rich mentioned, there's an absolute opportunity from a business perspective, and it's about mindset shift to help people to realise that there is a financial opportunity there. Examples are we are a venture capital fund. We look for the same returns as traditional VCs, but we put an impact lens over all of our investments. And we've found some great opportunities in the impact space, in the disability space particularly, that we think will generate outsized returns. And so one example is Loop Plus, and they've went through the Remarkable Accelerator as well. They've created a software platform and a cushion to help people in wheelchairs manage the risk of pressure sores. And so there, as you mentioned, there are a huge number of people with a disability and a huge number of people in wheelchairs that need to manage that risk. And so I think, there's a great opportunity there from a commercial perspective as well as social.
And then there was a report that your organisation produced that said that less than 1% of funds under management in Australia is focused on impact investment. What are the blockers to this being, I guess, more regular part of the investment portfolio mix?
Yeah, I think it's, again, going back to that kind of cognitive dissonance between, what is reality versus what is the kind of preconceptions of how you can generate returns. And there's the idea that you have to have a trade-off between returns and social and environmental benefit. And I think that's why it's been slow in terms of kind of bringing more capital into this space. But as we mentioned before, it's increasingly growing, and people are realizing that you don't have to necessarily trade off impact and returns. And I should say that impact is very subjective. And so there are lots of different definitions to that. So, you know, that's a whole nother conversation. But I guess what I'm kind of moving towards is that different levels of impact in your investments, and also different levels of financial returns. And I think it's just that people have thought about these things with different parts of the brain. One feels more emotional, one feels more kind of numbers and logical kind of based. And so I think that that's bringing those things together is really important for people to be able to realise there is true opportunity here for making a good return and making a positive difference in the world.
And Rich, your organisation, as you said before, surveys around about 1,500 public companies in North America to really determine which companies have an understanding of the value of disability to their business, and those who are simply kind of checking a box or going through the motions, or perhaps even worse. And in the last 12 months, there were 12 companies through your research that were actually downgraded. I'm interested in that because I would have thought, like, once they get the size of this market and the value of it, that they'd want to keep going with that. Why do you think these 12 companies have gone backwards in the last 12 months?
So there's a difference between why a company would do this and how a company would do this, right? So the why is pretty easy. It's easy to convince somebody to do this. To do it well is a completely different thing, right? So what we see quite a bit is a company, a large business, will spend a couple of years putting together an ERG or doing these lunch-and-learn events, and have these all feel-good charity wallets, and they'll make XYZ promises, and then when you check back in 2 years, they haven't taken the next step, right? And the next step is connecting with your customers and your employees to make their experiences better, and to do that in a way that drives revenue up or costs it down. So what we do is we go as secret shopper, and we go see what these companies are actually doing versus what they're saying they're doing. And if there's a disconnect between the two, we will punish that company, and we will take them down a couple of notches. I will say that the last couple of years, there's been an increase in the rhetoric, and that hasn't been matched by actual activity by companies. And that's a trend that we're quite disturbed by, actually.
Yeah, brilliant. And just a reminder as well to make sure that if you have any questions, please feel free to ask any of the panelists by putting that in the Q&A function. And if you're following us on social media, please use the hashtag #RemarkableInsights, and you can find us at Remarkable Tech. So let's shift kind of from the issues into the opportunities. If this kind of convergence can happen and does happen, the kind of the bringing together of conscious capital and the value of the disability dollar, what are the opportunities here? And Tamara, let's start with you. What are the opportunities around disruption for this market?
Yeah, I'd just firstly like to draw on what Rich was saying on a couple of points. I think in Australia, what we saw was a lot of people jump in without really understanding the context of the market or really having the insights from the consumer. And I think that was a real, something we're seeing now at Arima Research working with providers, is that people and businesses are really starting to question, do I know my customer well enough? Am I serving them well enough? And how do I understand what they're actually wanting from an experience? whether it be a product or a service. So I think there's real opportunities there as providers are starting to question their business models and how they can actually have that leading edge around where are the opportunities for collaboration. So I can't see it happening through providers without collaboration or partnership with other investors or with other entrepreneurs or innovators themselves. So I'd say that's one of the opportunities. I think there's a real opportunity to actually not have to do things from scratch, but to partner really well to get product to market or services to market for the benefit of all those partnerships. The other space I'd say is was a focus, and I'm really pleased to say something we're driving under the agency, and I understand that's continued, is what we were calling the home and living space. So this is really questioning traditional models of accommodation. What does support looks like? Does it have to be one-to-one? Can it be remote? What are the opportunities in that space to give people more freedom in their life and greater independence? And the other part of that, which I think is a really still an evolving area, is capacity building. And Rachel spoke, and I know Remarkable's had some great tech solutions in that space about this isn't just about providing services, it's building people's ability and confidence within that marketplace and their own lives. So I think technology has a huge part of that, and I think technologies help solve two problems that sit in Australia. We're a really big country, and people who now have funding and money can't actually get the services or what they actually need, and they're stuck with what was just existing in there. So I think technology can solve that, but also budget issues. If I can do better with my money by using technology, then I can do more in my life or with my funding. So I think there's real opportunities around that. And COVID, I think, has really thrown the gauntlet now, and now is the time. People are really adopting new and different ways of doing things. We're seeing more of mainstream come into the disability space, which is really pleasing too. So, we mentioned, home automation, wearables. I know I have my watch, and these are mainstream technologies that need to be really looked at in terms of how they actually benefit people with a disability as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think, Rich, I've heard you talk about this kind of area of, don't design for disability, design from disability, and that kind of understanding of kind of market-based products and services that are better for everyone. Do you just want to talk a little bit to that?
We think that's the biggest opportunity globally in this space, is understanding your customer, how they use your product, your experience, and breaking it down by disability functionality, and then mapping those use cases to core users. And what that does is it does two things. A, it makes your product, service, or experience better for people with disabilities, which is a good thing. And B, it allows you to experience the economies of scale of taking it to all of your customers. And when you do that, the returns go parabolic. They really do. And we think that as companies and brands, and quite frankly governments, start having these conversations with their disabled customers and start understanding those use cases and building those insights into design, this market will change the face of the world, not just socially, but economically as well. And it gets us outside of this idea that government has to run this space. It gets us outside this idea that this isn't sustainable financially. We know it is. We've seen it happen dozens of times, right? The this is not 10 years ago when this is a theory, right? We're doing it every day now, right? So we think that as this becomes normal for those second tier companies and the bigger governments of the world, some of the struggles that we think are very difficult to overcome right now will become routine, right? Will become just something that we kind of chuckle at and we say we can't believe we had to deal with that like that 20 years ago. Right? So that's what we see coming. My only caveat is the difficulty in doing that is the process. It's not the why, it's the how.
Yes.
And this has to go into organizations that are large, complex, with many different variables called human beings that tend to throw things into chaos on a daily basis, right? So while it may seem pretty straightforward from a theoretical point of view, this is a very complex change management process that is fascinating to go through.
Yeah, and I guess it is a complex process, but we've seen lots of examples in the past where technologies that have been designed from disability are now mainstream things that we are using every single day, and so we know that it's possible, right? We think of you know, the earliest email protocols, things around our keyboard that was designed so that someone's blind partner could actually type legible letters to people. All of these things they have been technologies that have been created from the place of disability. So we know that it is possible. Why aren't we seeing more examples of this, Rich?
Because it takes risk. And it takes, yet as an individual manager for a brand or a product or a service or even a government agency, you've got to be willing to take risk. And quite often today, when you get down into the second and third tier companies, the ability to take that risk is very low.
Yeah.
So as a guy like me, I start to think of things like, okay, how do we reduce that risk? How do we make that step easier to take? And as a good financial guy, that all comes down to capital. Right?
Yeah.
And I guess I'd add to that, Rich, I think it's not, you know, where does the risk come from? And I think for too long, this space has been seen as a social responsibility, corporate, you know, as part of our plan. And I think the realization is that we actually, we really need to challenge those foundations. As you said, there's been too much that's already happened that's led to great innovations for people with disability. We know it's profitable. We've got the right infrastructure. I think in Australia, what's probably been a challenge is what you were saying earlier, Rach, is that it seems to be this is a space for not-for-profits. And I know certainly with my conversations with people with disability and family members and providers, that there was that permission seeking, but them also not seeing themselves as the entrepreneurs, as the business leaders, as those that could contribute or develop ideas. And I think we're getting the right infrastructure in Australia. I think the more of that there is, the better placed we'll be, and people will start to realise this isn't a risk, this is a real market.
So the good news is there are lots of models out there to overcome the risk. They're just not in disability, right? So if you look at solar power, 10 years ago, solar power was an expensive way to produce energy. Today, it's one of the cheapest ways to produce energy. How did that happen? Well, somebody came in and funded the R&D to make that happen, right? that funding was done to take away that risk. Right? So as a good finance geek, the only way to reduce risk is to increase returns on capital. And that's probably got to come from investors or government.
I think the other point there, just, in reflecting on one of the biggest issues being that people just aren't aware what the lived experience is like and what coming from disability looks like, because we lack diversity in teams and understanding the issues and the benefits. I think not only a lack of understanding of the problem itself, but also how to kind of leverage and get benefits. And I guess an example I'm thinking of is a business called Exceptional, also went through Remarkable, that helps people with autism get jobs in software testing and software roles. And that's because they're actually better and uniquely placed because they've got unique skills in that space to be able to outperform others. And I think without knowing things like that, people will just put disabilities in one bucket and not understand what the benefits are, as well as challenges along the way, but then the opportunities on the other side.
So it's that's a great point. And the first step that companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft took in this space was to understand what those functional requirements were, right? So they went out, they talked to their customers, they put them through context-specific environments for their products and services, and they started to unpack how that worked, right? So with that step, what did they do? They reduced their risk because they increased their information, right? I hear a lot of people talk about doing that through hiring people with disabilities. I don't think that's the way to go about it. Hiring people with disabilities is a goal unto itself. Learning about your customer, learning how your customer uses your products is a very distinct effort that has to stand alone.
I think, Rich, you said in our conversation earlier this week that employment of people with disability is the tail that wags the dog. Is that the right quote?
It's a symptom of success, actually,
Yes.
right? So
yeah.
We spent the past 25 years in North America trying to do that on its own merits. And it's quite frankly failed miserably, right? Because the corporate muscle wasn't convinced of the reason behind it. However, when you are Google or Apple or Microsoft and you make your money delighting people with disabilities, it's very easy to attract people with disabilities to you as employees. Right? So I do think it is the tail that wags the dog.
Yeah. We've had a comment from Chris actually in the chat to say, is there kind of a fear of kind of from companies being tasked with or being branded with that they are profiteering or kind of exploiting the customers with disability? Have you seen anything around that at all, Rich?
The answer I had to that one is most companies sell to women and they don't worry about profiteering off women, right? So I think that's more of a social construct than it is a economic one. And I would suggest to disability groups that they fight like hell to avoid that.
And Rach, what about just kind of one of the final questions before we kind of go to a couple of questions that we've got on the chat on Q&A. what do you see as, what's your hope for the future of this investment space, particularly around kind of this convergence between the two, but more broadly as well around impact?
So I think for me, one of the biggest things is really just my hope, and I think what will happen is that with the transfer of wealth to millennials, we're going to see something like $68 trillion in America alone go from baby boomers to millennials by, within the next 10 years, that they leverage their desire to do social good and, address environmental issues as well, to think about things differently and see the opportunities in spaces like disability. I really hope that is going to be the case, and I have a gut feel that it will be, especially seeing the growth in impact investment to date, and I think that will just be accelerated with the transfer of wealth to millennials as well.
Brilliant. So we've had a couple of questions come through. We've got Marilena in Dubai, who's said that her government is currently working on new employment legislation. She wants to create a sustainable advocacy service for people with disability, potentially focusing on maybe something like a disability employment index. Has anyone on the panel got any advice for her startup? Rich, do you want to take that one?
Focus on what's important to the employer, not people with disabilities.
Yes.
The hardest part of getting companies to do this well is to do what's in their best interest. And when they do that, it's very successful, right? So I'll give you a good example. If you're a technology company, you don't hire people with disabilities from a charity group. You go to MIT and hire people with disabilities from MIT, right? You do it the way you would normally do it with everybody else. You just put a disability flavor on it.
And I guess I'm interested in the, because we've had similar conversations around employment and gender diversity around that, and some people have seen that the role that that quotas have been kind of an interim measure. Are you saying that we perhaps don't need the interim measure? We still go for the best, but we make sure that we have our anti-bias kind of glasses on?
So I don't think it's binary. I don't think you can do one or the other. I think you've got to do both, because what causes a company to move first might be compliance, but they'll never be successful with compliance. So while you may coerce the first step, there's got to be a second step to say, okay, if I'm ever going to meet this damn quota, I can't focus on the damn quota. I got to focus on the supply. I got to focus on what the employees want and what they demand. And what they want and demand is success, like everybody else, right? So the quota can be the stick, but it can't be the strategy.
Yeah,
Yes.
Certainly agree with that, Rich. And one of the things I was going to say is, from a research perspective as well, I think you've touched on it there a little bit in terms of the demand, but I think certainly in Australia, we haven't seen, or we've seen jobs created that are not that aspirational, and we've all certainly seen people with disability not given real support or choices to develop their career paths and understand what that is beyond very menial roles. So I think any index, and there are a couple around in Australia, I think need to actually focus on both sides. How do people with a disability see themselves and their goals and their career aspirations and the skills that they possess, because the important part of that is translation back into business. I think that, as Rachel pointed out, Exceptional's done that incredibly well through Remarkable to really untap that hidden strengths-based approach to employment.
It's also pretty obvious that quotas failed to meet the goals anywhere in the world. So that should tell you something right there.
Yeah.
One of the other aspects for me is around making sure that some of the other barriers to employment are removed, like the unconscious bias, you know, and thinking about how recruitment practices can be adapted to be more inclusive. So whilst, you know, it goes to that point that Rich mentioned about just being, you know, hiring great people that is best for business. I think a lot of the reason there has been exclusion for certain kind of either demographics or people with disabilities has been that preconception or the bias that has come in the employment process, that there's, you know, that they're not the best candidate, which I think really needs to be challenged. So I think it is also recruitment processes that need to change.
And just on that, Rachel, I think we're talking about disability as a homogenous group here, and that's not, you know, that's not the world that we live in. We're all very unique and different people, and so that needs to be factored in as well.
So I'll push back on that a little bit, Rachel. I think the diversity space gets lazy sometimes when they fall back on those ideas of unconscious bias and all of these psychological things that cause us not to hire people. I think it comes down to one thing: accountability of senior leadership. When senior leadership decides to do this, people do it or they get fired. So I think you can do all the D&I training that you want. If CEOs and CHROs don't fire people for failing, this will never go anywhere.
Yeah, I agree with that, Rich. And I think it's less about the training necessarily for me as much as even creating processes that remove that bias. So we've invested in a platform called Applied that removes unconscious bias from or aims to as much as possible through behavioural economics and behavioural science in their platform. So the way that they recruit is not looking at CVs at all, and it's skills-based testing. So I think for me, it's not necessary, you know, it's very hard to remove unconscious bias through training because it's unconscious. So, you know, by actually kind of training people to remove that, I think it's very hard. It's good to be aware, but I think it has to be through the mechanisms people use for hiring and things like software. And that has to come from senior leadership. And that decision really has to come from the top. Otherwise, those things won't be put in place and no change will happen.
See, what you're talking about though is different. That's innovation in finding great people, right? What I see a lot is these empty conversations around diverse populations, diverse this, diverse that, equal this, equal that. I don't know what that means in a business context. I do know that if your boss gives you a target and you miss that target and you don't get fired for it, you're probably going to keep missing your target, right?
Yeah. So it's having that consciousness around that. Now we have kind of come to the end of our time, and there's a couple of questions that we still haven't been able to answer. We might take those offline. Want to finish by asking each of you very briefly, if you can, to give just one last insight. This whole webinar is called Remarkable Insights. So we want to finish with, what's your one insight that you'd like to leave our community with? Let's start with Rich.
The world is going to spend hundreds of trillions of dollars on infrastructure in the next 10 years. Do it right the first time, and you'll save 10% of that money.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. Rach, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So it's really important, I think, to challenge the status quo and think about how people can shift their mindset to think about the disability space as an opportunity and a real commercial opportunity to use business as a force for good in that world, and you can actually benefit from it. It's a win-win, and I think the biggest insight for me is the mindset shift that needs to happen is gradually getting there, and we just need to keep talking about it.
Brilliant. And Tamara?
I think the biggest insight that I could give that probably hasn't been discussed is under the Australian context is I urge providers to do better to partner with those entrepreneurs that are people with a disability that have the solution or have the problems that need solutions, or they want to see that change. And just remember, this is beyond also NDIS. I know it's acronym, sorry, Rich, but NDIS dollars. We're seeing people who will be in more employment. The policy landscapes there, the efficiency of use of budgets means that people will have more disposable income, either themselves or through their families. And I think, meeting customer needs is just critical.
Brilliant. Well, thank you to everyone who's come along today. I especially want to thank our panelists, Rich Donovan, Rachel Yang and Tamara Reinich. Also, thank you to Mark Sandon, our Auslan interpreter. So we are about harnessing technology to build social and economic and physical inclusion of people with disability. If you are solving a problem in this space, if you believe you have an up-and-coming business, we would love to speak with you. Please reach out to us. Head to our website. That's www.remarkable.org.au/accelerator. We also look forward to getting some feedback from you as well. So if you can stay on just after this to provide some feedback. As mentioned at the beginning, if you missed some of this or you'd like to go back and revisit some of this conversation, please go to our YouTube channel and subscribe so that you don't miss any of our future recordings as well. This kind of conversation is absolutely vital, and we believe there is really a convergence of these couple of things, but we believe that the time is right to have these conversations about the emergence of the talent and the passion of people with disability. Technology is just one of the ways that we can see some of those barriers come down around that. We hope you found today's discussion really fruitful. Please come along to our next one. It will be around International Day for People with Disability, Seeing the Ability in Disability. We hope you can join us then. Thanks everyone for coming along today, and we'll see you next time.